What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about warnings. I stood there that morning, my hands trembling as I held the documents that proved everything. The collapse was coming. Not in months, not in weeks, in days, maybe hours. And nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to listen to me. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now before this story continues. You need to hear what happened next. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and for 15 years I worked as a senior structural engineer for Morrison & Associates, one of the largest construction firms in the country. I had reviewed thousands of buildings, signed off on hundreds of projects, and my reputation was spotless. Until the day I discovered that everything we had built on Riverside Plaza was a lie. It started 3 weeks earlier on a routine inspection. I was walking through the underground parking garage of the Riverside Towers, a massive complex of 3 interconnected high-rises that housed over 2,000 residents and dozens of businesses. Luxury apartments, corporate offices, shopping centers. It was the crown jewel of the city's downtown revitalization project, and it was my firm that had engineered the entire thing. As I walked past column B47 in the lowest level, something caught my eye. A crack. Not just any crack. A hairline fracture that ran diagonally across the reinforced concrete support. My stomach dropped. That column was part of the primary load-bearing system for Tower 2, the tallest of the 3 buildings at 47 stories. I immediately called for a full structural analysis. My team spent the next week running tests, examining core samples, reviewing the original construction documents. And that's when we found it. The concrete used in over 60% of the support columns didn't meet specifications. It wasn't even close. Instead of the high-grade, reinforced mixture that had been approved and paid for, someone had substituted a cheaper blend, one that was already showing signs of deterioration after just 5 years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I started digging through the project files. The substitution wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, systematic, and it went all the way to the top. Someone at Morrison & Associates had approved the cheaper materials, pocketed the difference, and falsified the inspection reports. The signatures on the documents were forgeries. The test results had been altered. Everything was a lie. And when I calculated the load-bearing capacity of those compromised columns against the actual weight of the buildings above them, the numbers made my blood run cold. But what happened when I tried to report this, nobody could have predicted. I went to my supervisor first, James Chen, a man I had worked with for over a decade. I showed him everything, the test results, the falsified documents, the calculations that proved the buildings were in imminent danger. He looked at the papers, then looked at me and said 4 words that still haunt me. "Sarah, let it go." Let it go? 2,000 people's lives were at stake and he wanted me to let it go? I demanded to know why. He closed his office door and explained the truth. Morrison & Associates was already drowning in debt from cost overruns on other projects. If this scandal broke, the company would be destroyed. Lawsuits, criminal charges, bankruptcy, it would all come crashing down. And so would we. Every employee, every pension, every career, gone. Think about your family, he said. Think about your daughter's college fund. Think about your mortgage. Is it really worth throwing everything away over something that might never happen? Might never happen? The evidence was right there in front of us. Those buildings could collapse at any moment. But James had made his position clear. If I pursued this, I would be doing it alone. So I went higher. I went to the CEO, Robert Morrison himself, the grandson of the company's founder. Surely he would do the right thing. Surely he would understand the magnitude of what we were facing. I was wrong. Morrison didn't just dismiss my concerns, he threatened me. If I spoke about this to anyone outside the company, he would sue me for breach of contract, defamation, and corporate sabotage. He would destroy my career, make sure I never worked as an engineer again. And then he played his final card. He showed me a file they had compiled on me. Every small mistake I had ever made, every decision that could be questioned, all documented and ready to be used against me if I became a problem. But I couldn't stay silent, not when I knew what was coming. So I did what I had to do. I went to the city's building department. I filed an official complaint, provided copies of all my evidence, and demanded an immediate evacuation and inspection of Riverside Plaza. The response came 2 days later. My complaint had been reviewed by qualified experts, who determined there was no immediate danger to public safety. The buildings would remain open while they conducted a thorough investigation over the next 6 months. 6 months. We didn't have 6 months. We might not even have 6 days. I later found out that Robert Morrison had connections on the city council. Phone calls were made. Favors were called in. My evidence was buried before it ever had a chance to be properly examined. That's when I knew I had to go public. I contacted the local news stations, the newspapers, anyone who would listen. And you know what happened? Nothing. The major outlets wouldn't touch the story without independent verification, which the city had already denied existed. The few reporters who showed interest quickly backed off after their editors received calls from Morrison's legal team. I tried posting on social media, but my accounts were immediately hit with takedown notices for spreading false information that could cause public panic. I was being erased, silenced, made invisible, and all the while, I could feel time running out. 3 days ago, I went to Riverside Plaza myself. I stood outside Tower 2 with a homemade sign that read, "Danger. These buildings are not safe. Evacuate now." I handed out printed copies of my evidence to anyone who would take them. Some people looked at me with pity, others with annoyance. Most just walked past like I didn't exist. One woman actually laughed and said, "If these buildings were really dangerous, don't you think someone important would be doing something about it?" That's the thing about warnings. People don't want to believe them. It's too inconvenient, too frightening, too disruptive to their normal lives. They'd rather believe that everything is fine, that the experts have it under control, that someone else will handle it. They couldn't accept that I, one woman with a sign, might be the only person telling them the truth. Security eventually escorted me off the property. As they walked me to my car, I saw families going about their day, children playing in the courtyard, people carrying groceries to their apartments, business people heading to meetings, all of them completely unaware that they were living and working in a death trap. That was yesterday. This morning I woke up to my phone, exploding with notifications. The collapse had begun. Tower 2, exactly as I had predicted. The compromised columns finally gave way under the weight they were never designed to bear. And I tried to warn them. God help me, I tried. The sound still echoes in my nightmares. It wasn't like the explosions you see in movies. No dramatic fireball. No slow-motion collapse. It was a deep, grinding rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by the sharp crack of concrete, fracturing under impossible pressure. I was in my kitchen making coffee when my phone started buzzing. The first message was from a former colleague. "Sarah, turn on the news. Now." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the remote. And there it was. Live footage of Riverside Plaza. Tower 2 was sagging. That's the only word for it. The entire structure had shifted about 3 feet to the east, creating a visible lean that made it look like some kind of surreal art installation. But this was no art. This was physics. This was gravity. This was everything I had warned them about finally happening. The news anchor's voice was strained, professional training barely masking the panic underneath. "We're getting reports of structural failure at Riverside Plaza in downtown. Authorities are evacuating the building now. We don't yet know if there are any casualties." Any casualties. The words felt like knives. I knew exactly how many people worked in that tower. I knew exactly how many families lived there. I had memorized those numbers weeks ago when I was running my calculations, trying to make someone, anyone, understand the urgency. Tower 2 alone housed 850 residential units, with an average occupancy of 2.3 people per apartment. That was nearly 2,000 residents, plus the commercial spaces on the lower 15 floors, offices, restaurants, a daycare center on the 3rd floor that had just opened last month. But what nobody understood yet was that Tower 2 wasn't the only problem. The 3 towers weren't just built next to each other. They were structurally interconnected. They shared foundation elements, underground parking levels, and several sky bridges on the upper floors. The engineering principle was called load sharing, the idea that the 3 towers would distribute stress and provide mutual support. It was supposed to make them stronger. Instead, I had discovered it made them vulnerable. When one tower failed, it would pull on the others like a drowning person dragging down their rescuers. And Tower 2 was already drowning. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the structural models I had created during my investigation. If Tower 2 continued to shift at the rate I was observing on the news, and there was no reason to think it would stop, it would reach critical failure within hours, and when it went down, it would take Towers 1 and 3 with it. I had to do something. I called 911, demanding to speak to whoever was coordinating the evacuation. The operator told me the situation was under control and that I should stay away from the area. Under control? Nothing about this was under control. I tried to explain who I was, what I knew, but she cut me off. Ma'am, emergency responders are on scene. They have the situation handled. Please stay off this line so people who need help can get through. I hung up and immediately called the fire department directly, then the police department, then every emergency contact number I could find. Each time, the same response. They knew about the situation. They were handling it. I needed to stop calling. Nobody wanted to hear that the engineer who had tried to warn them weeks ago was now telling them the evacuation needed to happen faster, needed to include all 3 towers, needed to extend to the surrounding blocks because when those buildings came down, the debris field would be catastrophic. The most frustrating part? I was right there. I had all the answers, and nobody would listen. By noon, the news coverage had exploded. Every channel was showing the same footage, Tower 2's increasingly dramatic lean, the chaotic evacuation, the fire trucks and ambulances lining the streets. Reporters were interviewing residents who had made it out, many still in their pajamas, carrying hastily grabbed belongings. One elderly man held a bird cage with a terrified parakeet inside. A young mother clutched her 2 small children, tears streaming down her face as she described hearing horrible sounds coming from the walls. These people had no idea how lucky they were to be standing on solid ground, giving interviews, how close they had come to being statistics instead of survivors. But not everyone was out. The news anchor reported that authorities believed approximately 200 people were still inside Tower 2, some trapped by debris, others sheltering in place because they couldn't reach the stairwells. The elevators had been automatically shut down the moment the building's emergency systems detected the structural movement. That meant 47 floors of stairs, and for many residents, the elderly, the disabled, parents with small children, that might as well have been Mount Everest. Rescue teams were going floor by floor, but it was slow. Every minute they spent inside was a minute closer to complete collapse. I couldn't just sit there watching. I got in my car and drove toward downtown even though I knew they would never let me near the site. As I got closer, the traffic became impossible. A mix of people trying to evacuate the surrounding area and others like me drawn toward the disaster. Police had set up barricades 3 blocks out in every direction. I parked and approached on foot, my engineering credentials in hand, hoping someone would recognize that I could help. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 weeks ago, they had thrown me out. Now I was trying to break back in. A police officer stopped me at the barricade. I explained who I was, showed him my credentials, tried to tell him I had critical information about the structural integrity of all 3 towers. He looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Ma'am, we have structural engineers on site. The fire department has their own assessment team. They don't know what I know. I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I discovered the falsified materials reports. I know exactly which columns are compromised. I can tell you how much time we have before. He held up his hand. Ma'am, I need you to step back. You're interfering with emergency operations. Interfering? I was trying to save lives, but arguing with him was pointless. I could see it in his eyes. I was just another civilian trying to insert myself into a crisis, probably hoping for my 15 minutes of fame. He had no way of knowing I was the person who had predicted this exact scenario. No way of knowing that if someone had listened to me weeks ago, we wouldn't be standing here at all. I stepped back, but I didn't leave. I couldn't. I stood there on the other side of the barricade watching through the gaps between emergency vehicles as Tower 2 continued its slow-motion collapse. And then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Tower 1 was moving. It was subtle, just a slight shift in the window reflections, a barely perceptible change in the building's profile against the sky. But I knew what it meant. The load transfer had begun. Tower 2's failure was pulling on Tower 1's structure, exactly as I had predicted in my models. And if Tower 1 was moving, Tower 3 would be next. The cascade failure I had warned about, the scenario that everyone had dismissed as alarmist and improbable, was happening right before my eyes. Screamed at the police officer, pointing frantically at Tower 1. "It's moving! You need to evacuate that building now. They're all coming down." He turned to look where I was pointing, squinting at the building. "I don't see anything, ma'am." "Please calm down. I'm a structural engineer. I know what I'm seeing. That building is starting to fail." Other officers were looking at me now, hands moving toward their equipment, probably debating whether I was a threat that needed to be removed. One started walking toward me, speaking into his radio. I knew what was about to happen. They were going to arrest me for causing a disturbance, for interfering, for any number of charges they could think of to get the crazy lady away from their crisis scene. But I couldn't let them silence me. Not again, not when people were about to die. "Listen to me," I shouted, loud enough that several nearby civilians turned to look. "Those buildings are all connected. When Tower 2 goes down, it will take the others with it. You need to evacuate everyone within a 6-block radius. You need to—" The officer grabbed my arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with me. You're causing a panic." A panic? There wasn't enough panic. These people didn't understand what was about to happen. But before he could pull me away, something extraordinary happened. A man in the crowd, mid-40s, wearing an expensive suit despite the chaos, pushed forward. "Wait, I know her. That's Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She works for Morrison and Associates." The officer paused and the man continued, addressing me directly. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm David Chen. I work in Tower 1, 32nd floor. I received one of your flyers last week, the one about the structural problems." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. My warning. The one I had been handing out like some kind of doomsday prophet. "I thought you were crazy. But then this morning—" He gestured toward the leaning tower. "Is it true? Is Tower 1 really in danger?" Every eye was on me now. The officers, the civilians, even some of the emergency workers who had overheard. This was my moment. Maybe my last chance to make someone, anyone, understand. And God help me, I was going to make them listen. What happened next felt like trying to convince people the sky was falling while they debated the weather forecast. I looked David Chen directly in the eyes and said the words that would either save lives or make me look like a complete fool. "If you value your life, you will get everyone you know out of Tower 1 in the next 30 minutes. After that, I can't promise the building will still be standing." The color drained from his face. Around us, people started murmuring, some pulling out their phones to call loved ones, others looking skeptically between me and the towers. The police officer's grip on my arm loosened slightly. He spoke into his radio. "Command, we have a situation. Here, someone claiming to be a structural engineer saying Tower 1 is compromised. Can we get confirmation?" Static. Then a response. "Negative. Our engineers have assessed Tower 1. It's stable. Focus on Tower 2 evacuation only." See? This was exactly what I had been fighting against. Their engineers, the same ones who had probably missed or ignored the warning signs for months, were making assessments based on incomplete information. They didn't know about the falsified materials, reports. They didn't understand the load-sharing dynamics. They were flying blind and calling it expertise. "Your engineers are wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tower 1 shares foundation elements with Tower 2. The underground parking structure connects all 3 buildings. When Tower 2's columns failed, the load redistributed. But the columns in Tower 1 were built with the same substandard concrete. They can't handle the extra stress. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to—" The officer started, but David Chen interrupted. "How much time?" he asked urgently. "You said 30 minutes, how do you know?" I pulled out my phone, opened my engineering software, and showed him the model I had built. It looked like gibberish to most people. Complex finite element analysis, stress distribution charts, time-based failure projections. But David worked in tech. He understood data visualization even if he didn't understand the engineering behind it. "See this?" I pointed to the red zones spreading through Tower 1's structure. "This is happening right now. The building is absorbing load from Tower 2, but it's already weakened. These support columns here, here, and here, they're experiencing stress levels far beyond their capacity. But they haven't failed yet," David said, trying to find hope. "That means they might hold, right?" God, I wished I could tell him yes. Concrete doesn't fail gradually. It fails catastrophically. Think of it like bending a stick. You can put more and more pressure on it and it seems fine, seems stable, right up until the moment it snaps. These columns are bending. They're holding. But the moment they reach their breaking point, it happens all at once. David finished, his engineering background giving him just enough knowledge to understand the horror. And you think that's going to happen in 30 minutes? I think it could happen in 5 minutes, or 15, or an hour. But I know it's going to happen today. And when it does, anyone inside that building is dead. The crowd around us had grown. People were recording on their phones, live streaming probably, spreading this moment across social media. Part of me realized this could destroy what was left of my career. If I was wrong, I would be the engineer who caused mass panic over nothing. But if I was right, and I stayed silent, I would have to live with blood on my hands. David Chen made his decision. Ator turned to the crowd and shouted, "Everyone who lives or works in Tower 1, get out now. Don't wait for official word, just go." Several people immediately started running toward the barricades, pushing past confused police officers. Others were calling people they knew in the building, urgent conversations mixing with the ambient noise of sirens and helicopters. The officer was back on his radio, more agitated now. "Command, we have civilians claiming Tower 1 is about to collapse. We're losing control of the perimeter. Advise." The response was angry, authoritative. "Maintain order. We cannot have unauthorized evacuations causing additional casualties. The building is stable. Repeat, Tower 1 is stable." But it wasn't, and I could prove it. "Give me 5 minutes with your incident, Commander," I pleaded with the officer. "Let me show them my analysis. If they still think I'm wrong after that, I'll leave quietly. But you have to let me try." He looked torn. Duty. Telling him to follow orders. Human instinct telling him something was very wrong. His decision was made for him when a sound ripped through the air. Not as loud as the initial failure, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were listening for. It was the sound of concrete fracturing, and it came from Tower 1. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. The crowd went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in chaos. People who had been skeptically watching now ran for their lives. The police barricades were overrun as civilians fled the area. Emergency workers shouted into radios, trying to coordinate a response to something they didn't understand. And Tower 1 was groaning. I could hear the structure screaming as it tried to hold together against forces it was never designed to resist. The officer looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the moment he stopped seeing a nuisance and started seeing someone who might be right. "Come with me," he said, grabbing my arm again, but this time pulling me toward the emergency command post instead of away from it. We ran. Through the chaos, past abandoned vehicles, toward a cluster of emergency vehicles and city officials. The incident commander was a woman in her 50s, fire chief's insignia on her uniform, surrounded by tablets showing building schematics and emergency response maps. "Chief Morrison," the officer started, but I interrupted. "No relation to Robert Morrison, I hope?" I asked, half joking, half terrified she might be connected to the man who had tried to bury my warnings. She looked at me sharply. "Who are you?" "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, structural engineer. I'm the one who filed the complaint about these buildings 3 weeks ago." Her expression hardened. "You're the one causing panic at my perimeter. I'm the one trying to prevent a catastrophe. Tower 1 is about to fail, and when it does, it's going to take Tower 3 with it." I thrust my phone at her, showing my models, my calculations, my evidence. "Look at this. The buildings are structurally linked. The load redistribution is already happening. You need to evacuate Tower 1 and Tower 3 immediately." She glanced at the screen, then back at me. "I have 3 structural engineers telling me those buildings are stable. What makes you think you know better?" "Because I know what they don't. The truth about what's holding these buildings up. Because I discovered the materials." "Fraud," I said. "The concrete in these support columns isn't what it's supposed to be. It's substandard, already deteriorating, and it cannot handle the stress it's under right now." Chief Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Materials fraud? That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. I have documentation, test results, everything. Robert Morrison's company substituted cheap materials and falsified the inspection reports. That's why Tower 2 failed, and that's why Tower 1 is about to follow." For the first time, I saw doubt in her expression. Not belief, not yet, but the first crack in her certainty. If what you're saying is true, why didn't anyone listen to you before? Because the people who could have done something had too much to lose. But you can still save lives. You can order those evacuations right now. She looked at the towers, then at her engineers, then back at me. I could see the calculation happening in her mind. The risk of acting on unverified information versus the risk of ignoring a potential catastrophe. Then another sound, louder this time, unmistakable. Another fracture, another failure, another step toward disaster. One of her engineers looked up from his tablet, face pale. "Chief, we're detecting movement in Tower 1. Small but measurable. The building's shifting on its foundation." Chief Morrison's jaw clenched. She grabbed her radio and made the call that should have been made weeks ago. "All units, evacuate Tower 1 immediately. Full evacuation, all floors. This is not a drill." Finally someone was listening. But as I watched emergency workers rush toward Tower 1, as alarms began blaring from the building's emergency system, I felt no satisfaction, only dread. Because I had seen the data, I had run the numbers, and I knew we were out of time. The evacuation would save some people, but not everyone. Not nearly everyone. The first responders were already inside, racing upstairs to reach residents who couldn't evacuate on their own. It would take at least 15 minutes to clear the lower floors, 30 to 45 minutes to reach the upper levels, and we didn't have 45 minutes. We might not even have 15. I watched the building, analyzing every visible detail, looking for signs of progression. The windows on the 23rd floor seemed slightly misaligned now, the spacing between them uneven, indication that the floor plates were shifting. The facade on the eastern side showed stress cracks that hadn't been visible an hour ago. Most damning of all, the sky bridge connecting Tower 1 to Tower 3 was visibly sagging, the tension in the structure creating a curve that shouldn't exist in rigid steel and concrete. Tower 3. In all the chaos, everyone was focused on 1 and 2, but 3 was just as vulnerable, just as compromised, and there had been no evacuation order for it. "Chief," I called out, "Tower 3 needs to be evacuated too. The load transfer." "One crisis at a time, Dr. Mitchell," she replied, not unkindly but firmly. "We don't have the resources to evacuate all 3 buildings simultaneously. But physics doesn't care about resources. Physics doesn't wait its turn." I started calculating in my head, trying to determine which building would fail first and what the cascade effect would be. Tower 2 was already critically compromised, held up by sheer inertia and whatever. Strength remained in its damaged structure. Tower 1 was actively failing, the fractures spreading through its support system like cracks in ice. But Tower 3 was different. It had been absorbing stress from both of its neighbors, its structure bending and flexing under loads it was never designed to bear. And unlike the others, 3 had been hit with a double impact. Stress from Tower 2's initial failure, then additional stress when Tower 1 began to shift. What if 3 went first? The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if I had been so focused on the obvious progression, 2, then 1, then 3, that I had missed the real danger? What if Tower 3, stressed from both sides, subjected to conflicting forces, was actually the most vulnerable? I spun toward Chief Morrison. "We need to evacuate 3, not later, now." "Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but..." "No, you don't understand. If Tower 3 goes down while people are evacuating Tower 1, the debris field will..." And then it happened. Not gradually, not with warning. Just like I had explained to David Chen about the stick bending until it snaps. Tower 3 snapped. The sound of Tower 3's collapse was the sound of the world ending. It started with a crack so loud it felt like thunder splitting the earth, followed by the deep, grinding roar of thousands of tons of concrete and steel giving up their fight against gravity. I watched, frozen in horror, as the building seemed to pause, hovering in that impossible moment between standing and falling, and then it came down. Not straight down like controlled demolitions you see on TV. This was chaos. The tower twisted as it fell, the upper floors rotating clockwise while the lower floors crumbled, creating a spiral of destruction that defied belief. 39 floors of homes and lives and memories, turning into a cloud of concrete dust and twisted metal in less than 15 Seconds. The shockwave hit us a moment later. A wall of air and debris that knocked people off their feet, shattered windows blocks away, and sent emergency vehicles rocking on their suspension. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the pavement, the breath knocked out of my lungs. For a few seconds, I couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing. Couldn't see anything but the massive dust cloud expanding outward like a nuclear bloom. Couldn't think anything but the same three words repeating in my mind. I tried warning them. I tried warning them. I tried warning them. But Tower 3 wasn't the end. It was the catalyst. As I struggled to my feet, coughing on the dust that filled the air, I saw Tower 1 beginning its own collapse. The loss of Tower 3 had severed the structural connections between the buildings, removing support that 1 had been relying on. At the same time, the debris from 3's fall had slammed into 1's base, damaging ground floor, columns that were already compromised. The building didn't stand a chance. It went down faster than 3 had, imploding floor by floor from the bottom up, each level pancaking onto the one below in a progressive collapse that consumed the tower in less than 10 seconds. The people who were evacuating, the first responders who had rushed in to help, they never made it out. The second shockwave was worse than the first. The debris field expanded rapidly, chunks of concrete the size of cars flying through the air like missiles. I saw an ambulance crushed by falling steel beams, watched a police car disappear beneath a wave of rubble, heard screams from people who had thought they were far enough away, safe enough, only to be caught by the expanding destruction. Chief Morrison was shouting into her radio, trying to coordinate a response. But what response could there be? This wasn't a rescue operation anymore. It was a disaster beyond anything the city had prepared. For 2 towers down, thousands of tons of debris, and Tower 2, damaged, unstable, having just lost both of its supporting neighbors, was still standing for about 30 seconds. Then Tower 2, the building where this nightmare began, finally gave up. It didn't collapse so much as disintegrate, the structure coming apart in pieces as the weakened columns failed simultaneously. Without the support of its neighbors, without the load-sharing system that had kept it partially upright, despite its damage, there was nothing left to hold it together. The debris from its fall merged with the rubble from the other towers, creating a singular mass of destruction that covered 6 blocks and rose 3 stories high in places. The dust cloud was so thick it turned day into night, blocking out the sun completely. I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me, couldn't breathe without coughing, couldn't do anything but stand there in the darkness, covered in concrete dust, and realize that everything I had feared had come to pass, and I had tried to warn them. God help me, I had tried. But trying wasn't enough. Warning wasn't enough. Being right wasn't enough. 3 towers were gone. Thousands of people, residents, workers, first responders, were buried under the rubble. And I was still standing, still breathing, still alive, when so many others weren't. The guilt hit me harder than the shockwave had. I sank to my knees in the dust and debris, my hands pressed against the rubble-strewn ground, and I wept. Not gentle tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that tore through my chest and made it impossible to breathe. Because I knew that if someone, anyone, had listened to me 3 weeks ago, we wouldn't be here. Those people would still be alive. Those families would still be intact. Those buildings would still be standing, evacuated and under repair, but standing. Someone grabbed my shoulder. Through my tears and the dust, I saw David Chen. His expensive suit was torn and filthy, blood running from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raw. "I got out because of you. My wife got out because I called her. My colleagues got out because I warned them. But so many others didn't," I choked out. "I tried to warn everyone, but it wasn't enough. You should have been listened to," he interrupted firmly. "You did everything you could. This isn't your fault. This is Morrison's fault, the city's fault, everyone who chose money and reputation over lives, but not yours." I wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that I had done all I could, but the screams around us, the sirens, the sound of rescue workers calling out for survivors, it all said otherwise. I stood up slowly, wiping my eyes, trying to see through the dust. The command post where Chief Morrison had been was partially buried under debris. Emergency vehicles were crushed or damaged, though carefully organized response had dissolved into chaos as first responders tried to save their own colleagues, while also reaching victims in the rubble. I started walking toward the disaster site, but David held me back. "You can't go in there. It's not stable. More debris could fall at any moment. People need help, and you'll die trying to give it." But I couldn't just stand there. I pulled free from his grip and moved toward the rubble, picking my way carefully over chunks of concrete and twisted rebar. Around me, other civilians were doing the same, ignoring the danger, ignoring the orders to stay back, because there were people under that debris who might still be alive. We worked with our bare hands, moving smaller pieces, calling out for survivors, listening desperately for any response. I found a woman's shoe, a child's stuffed animal, a laptop bag with someone's name embroidered on it. Each item was a life, a story, a person who had been going about their day when everything collapsed around them, and I had tried to warn them. Hours passed. The dust began to settle, revealing the full scope of the devastation. Where 3 towers had stood that morning, there was now only rubble. The debris field extended far beyond what I had calculated, reaching buildings I had thought would be safe. The entire Riverside Plaza complex was gone. The underground parking structure had collapsed, taking with it anyone who had been trying to evacuate. Through the lower levels, the surrounding streets were impassable, blocking emergency vehicles from reaching the scene. The only access was on foot, and even that was treacherous, with unstable debris shifting underfoot and the constant danger of secondary collapses. Rescue teams arrived with dogs, sensors, heavy equipment, everything needed for urban search and rescue, but they were overwhelmed. This wasn't a single building collapse. It was 3 high-rises, nearly 4,000, residents and workers all buried under millions of tons of concrete and steel. The scope was beyond anything the city had trained for, beyond anything anyone had imagined, except me. I had imagined it. I had calculated it. I had predicted it down to the sequence of failures and the approximate time frame, and nobody had listened. Chief Morrison found me around sunset. She was covered in dust like everyone else, her uniform torn, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Dr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Apologies won't bring them back," I replied, not meanly, just stating the obvious. "No, but they might prevent the next time." She sat down on a piece of rubble beside me. "I need everything you have. All your documentation, all your evidence, everything. If what you said about materials fraud is true, if this could have been prevented." She trailed off, but I understood. This wasn't just a disaster. It was a crime, a massacre, and someone needed to be held accountable. "I'll give you everything," I promised, "but it won't be enough. The people responsible will have lawyers, money, connections. They'll find ways to avoid blame, to make it seem like this was unpredictable, unavoidable." "Not this time," Chief Morrison said with surprising conviction. "The world just watched 3 towers collapse, watched thousands of people die. There will be investigations at every level, city, state, federal. The media won't let this go. The families won't let this go. And I won't let this go." I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that justice would be served, that my warnings would finally be validated, that something good could come from this nightmare. But I had learned a hard lesson about what happens when profit conflicts with safety, when reputation conflicts with truth, when convenience conflicts with conscience. The powerful find ways to protect themselves, always. And the people like me, the ones who try to warn, who speak truth to power, who refuse to stay silent, we're the ones who pay the price. We sat there in silence as the sun set over the disaster site, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed obscenely beautiful given the horror below. Searchlights were being set up around the perimeter, teams preparing for night operations. The rescue effort would continue for days, maybe weeks, but we both knew the grim reality. In collapses like this, survival. Rates after the first few hours dropped dramatically. Most of the people we would find now would be bodies, not survivors. I thought about all the warnings throughout history that went unheeded. Cassandra, cursed to speak truth that no one believed. Scientists warning about climate change. Engineers warning about bridge failures. Whistleblowers warning about corporate malfeasance. The pattern was always the same. Someone sees the danger, tries to raise the alarm, and gets silenced or ignored until it's too late. And now I was part of that pattern. Another name on the list of people who tried to warn them but whose warnings came too fast. 3 months after the collapse, I sat in a hearing room that felt like a courtroom designed to judge my sanity rather than the truth. The Federal Building Investigation Committee had been convened to determine what caused the Riverside Plaza disaster, and I was the star witness, or the scapegoat, depending on who you asked. The room was packed with lawyers, journalists, family members of victims, and every city official who wanted to either distance themselves from the disaster or claim credit for the response. Robert Morrison sat 3 rows back, flanked by attorneys, his expression carefully neutral. The bastard had the nerve to look dignified, like he was the victim here instead of the architect of mass murder. Dr. Mitchell, the committee chairman began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had practiced this speech. You've made serious allegations about materials fraud, falsified inspection reports, and systematic negligence. Can you walk us through how you discovered these issues? I could, in excruciating detail. For the next 2 hours I presented everything: the initial crack I had found, the laboratory tests showing substandard concrete, the falsified documents with forged signatures, the calculations proving the buildings couldn't support their own weight. I showed them my emails to supervisors, my formal complaints to the city, my attempts to go public. I laid out the entire timeline of warnings that were ignored, buried, or actively suppressed, and I watched as, one by one, the people in that room realized they were complicit. The city building inspector who had dismissed my complaint shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly finding his notebook fascinating. The council member who had taken Morrison's call looked pale, probably calculating how to distance himself from the scandal. Even the journalists who had refused to run my story weeks ago couldn't meet my eyes. They all knew. On some level, they had all known. They just hadn't wanted to deal with the inconvenience of the truth. Dr. Mitchell, one of Morrison's attorneys, stood up. Isn't it true that you were terminated from Morrison and Associates for poor performance prior to making these allegations? Here we go. The character assassination. I had been waiting for this. I was terminated after I refused to stay silent about the safety issues. My employment records, which I'm sure you've thoroughly reviewed, show 15 years of exemplary performance reviews. But isn't it possible, the attorney continued smoothly, that you were simply mistaken? That your interpretation of the data was incorrect, and this tragedy was simply an unpredictable structural failure? There was nothing unpredictable about it, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I predicted it, down to the sequence of failures. If you had listened to me 3 weeks earlier, those towers would have been evacuated and undergoing emergency repairs. Instead, you chose to protect a corporation's reputation over 3,000 lives. The number hung in the air. 3,000 confirmed deaths, plus another 400 still missing, presumed dead. It was the worst building collapse in American history, surpassing even 9/11 in terms of casualties from structural failure, and every single death was preventable. Dr. Mitchell, the chairman, interjected, we have expert testimony from multiple structural engineers who reviewed the original plans and construction documents. They state that the design was sound and should have been safe for the intended use. Of course the design was sound, I replied. I should know. I helped design it. The problem wasn't the design. It was the execution. The materials that were actually used didn't match what was specified. That's the fraud. That's what killed those people. I pulled out my phone and projected an image onto the screen. 2 concrete samples side by side. This is what was specified in the plans. High-grade, reinforced concrete with a compressive strength of 6,000 psi. This is what was actually used. A cheaper mixture with a strength of barely 3,000 psi. Would you build a bridge rated for heavy trucks, and then substitute materials that could only handle compact cars? The analogy landed. I could see it in their faces. The understanding that this wasn't a technical failure, but a deliberate choice to cut costs at the expense of safety. Morrison's attorney jumped up again. Objection. These samples could be from anywhere. There's no chain of custody, no verification that these samples were taken by a certified testing laboratory 3 weeks before the collapse, I interrupted. The same laboratory that Morrison and Associates used for their falsified reports. The difference is these samples were tested honestly. The results are independently verifiable. The truth is in the chemistry, and chemistry doesn't lie. Chief Morrison, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. The rescue operations recovered concrete samples from the debris. We've had them tested independently. Dr. Mitchell's findings are correct. The materials used in the support columns were substandard across all 3 towers. A murmur ran through the room. This wasn't just one engineer making allegations anymore. This was official confirmation from the fire chief, who had overseen the disaster response. The evidence was irrefutable. Morrison's attorney sat down, his strategy crumbling as fast as his client's towers had. But Morrison himself finally stood, his voice carrying that practiced tone of wounded dignity that powerful men always seem to master. "Mr. Chairman, if I may address these allegations directly." The chairman nodded, and Morrison approached the microphone like he was accepting an award rather than answering for mass murder. "Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison and Associates has been building this city for 3 generations. My grandfather built the courthouse where many of you work. My father built the schools where your children learn. We have always put safety first." He paused for effect, and I wanted to scream. If there were indeed material substitutions, they were done without my knowledge or approval, by rogue contractors seeking to maximize their profits. We trusted our subcontractors, perhaps foolishly, and that trust was betrayed. Of course, blame the dead contractors. Blame the people who can't defend themselves. It was a masterful deflection, and I could see some committee members nodding along, eager to accept this narrative that let them off the hook too. If it was just rogue contractors, then the system hadn't failed. The regulations hadn't failed. The inspectors hadn't failed. It was just bad luck, bad actors, an unfortunate tragedy that no one could have prevented. Except I could prove otherwise. "Mr. Morrison," I stood, my voice cutting through his performance. "Do you recognize this signature?" I projected another document, an approval form for the material substitution, dated 18 months before the collapse. The signature at the bottom was Robert Morrison's. Not a forgery this time. The real thing, verified by handwriting experts. His face went white. The room exploded with noise. Journalists shouting questions, attorneys conferring frantically, committee members demanding order. Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish, gasping for air. Finally, he managed. I sign hundreds of documents. I can't be expected to review every." "This wasn't routine paperwork," I interrupted. "This was a formal request to substitute materials on a project worth $300 million. It required executive approval, your approval, which you gave, because it would save the company $42 million. $42 million that you valued more than 3,000 lives. The math was obscene. Roughly $14,000 per person killed. That's what their lives had been worth to him. Less than the cost of a decent car. Less than a year's tuition at the private school where Morrison sent his grandchildren. Less than nothing in his world of profit margins and quarterly reports. "I didn't know it would lead to this," Morrison said weakly, his dignified facade finally cracking. "No one could have predicted." "I predicted it," I shouted, my composure finally breaking. "I predicted it 3 weeks in advance. I gave you the evidence. I begged you to evacuate those buildings, and you threatened to destroy my career. You called the city council. You had my story killed. You did everything in your power to silence me because you knew that if the truth came out, you would lose everything." Tears were streaming down my face now, months of grief and rage and guilt pouring out. "Those people died because you cared more about your company's reputation than their lives, because you couldn't admit that you had made a mistake, because profit mattered more than people." The room was silent except for my sobs. Then slowly someone started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire gallery, filled with families of victims, was on their feet applauding. Not for me, but for the truth finally being spoken aloud. For someone finally saying what they had all been thinking. For justice, however inadequate, finally beginning. The committee chairman waited for the applause to die down before speaking. "Mr. Morrison, you are hereby held in contempt of this committee and remanded to federal custody pending criminal charges. This investigation will continue, but based on the evidence presented, today I am recommending immediate criminal proceedings for manslaughter, fraud, and criminal negligence." Federal marshals moved forward to take Morrison into custody. As they led him past me, he looked at me with such hatred that I actually stepped back. "You destroyed my family's legacy," he hissed. "For what? You can't bring them back. Nothing you do will bring them back. He was right about that. Nothing would bring back the young mother I had seen interviewed on the news, clutching her children who never made it out. Nothing would bring back the elderly man with the parakeet, who had returned to his apartment to get his late wife's photo albums and was buried in the collapse. Nothing would bring back the firefighters who had rushed in to save others, or the office workers who were just trying to do their jobs, or the children in that daycare center who never got to grow up. No, I agreed quietly. Nothing will bring them back. But maybe, just maybe, this will prevent the next time. Maybe your legacy will be the reason other engineers speak up, the reason other companies choose safety over profit, the reason other warnings are actually heard before it's too late. Morrison said nothing as the marshals led him away. I watched him go, feeling no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting a battle you knew you should have won before it ever started. Chief Morrison approached me as the hearing room began to empty. Dr. Mitchell, I want you to know, I'm sorry for not listening sooner, for not acting when you first brought this to our attention. I know, I said, and I did. She was one of the good ones, trying to do her job in a system that made it almost impossible to do the right thing. What will you do now? She asked. I had been thinking about that a lot lately. My career at Morrison & Associates was obviously over. My reputation in the engineering community was complicated. Some saw me as a hero, a whistleblower who had tried to prevent disaster. Others saw me as a troublemaker, someone who hadn't followed proper channels, who had caused panic, who had made them all look bad by being right when they were wrong. But I knew exactly what I was going to do. I'm starting a foundation, I told her. The Riverside Warning Foundation. We're going to train engineers to recognize the signs of structural failure, to document problems properly, to navigate the politics of speaking up without getting silenced. We're going to create legal protections for whistleblowers, fund independent structural assessments, and maintain a database of building safety concerns that can't be buried by corporate interests. Chief Morrison smiled slightly. That sounds like it will make you very unpopular with certain people. Good, I replied. Popularity is what got 3,000 people killed. I'd rather be unpopular and right than well-liked and silent. She shook my hand, a gesture of respect between two women who had been forced to watch a preventable disaster unfold because the people in power refused to listen. Then she left, and I was alone in the hearing room, surrounded by empty chairs and the weight of everything that had happened. David Chen found me there 20 minutes later. He had testified earlier in the day, describing how my warning had saved his life and the lives of his family. Now he held a folder thick with papers. What's that? I asked. Letters, he said, from survivors, from families of victims, from other engineers who have been in your position, trying to warn people about dangers no one wants to hear about. They want to help, with your foundation, with the legal cases, with making sure this never happens again. I took the folder, flipping through letters written in shaky handwriting, typed on official letterhead, scrawled on notebook paper. Each one was a story of someone who understood what it meant to see disaster coming and be powerless to stop it. Someone who wanted to make sure the next warning was heard before it was too late. We're going to change things, David said with quiet determination. Not because of what happened, but because of what you tried to prevent. Your warning, even though they didn't listen, it matters. It's going to save lives in the future, even if it couldn't save them then. I wanted to believe him. And maybe, for the first time since the collapse, I did. Because here's what I had learned. Warnings are not failures just because they come too fast for people to hear. The failure is in the not listening, not in the not warning. The failure is in valuing convenience over truth, profit over safety, reputation over lives. The failure is in silencing the people who see the danger instead of addressing the danger they see. I had tried to warn them, and yes, the collapse came too fast, but not because I was too slow, because they refused to move at all, and that was the lesson I would spend the rest of my life teaching. 6 months later, standing at the memorial erected at the site where Riverside Plaza once stood, I read the names carved into black granite. 3,412 names. 3,412 people who should still be alive. The memorial's design was simple but powerful. 3 broken towers reaching toward the sky, their tops, jagged and incomplete, a permanent reminder of what happens when warnings go unheeded. At the base, a plaque read, "They tried to warn us. May we never fail to listen again." Below that, my words from the hearing, "The failure is not in the warning. The failure is in the not listening." If you made it this far, you're special. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, hit that notification bell, and share this story with 3 people who need to understand why warnings matter. Why? Engineers, scientists, whistleblowers, and ordinary people who see danger must be heard before it's too late. Because somewhere right now, someone is trying to warn us about the next disaster. Someone is holding evidence that could save lives. Someone is being told to stay silent, to not cause panic, to trust that the people in charge know what they're doing. And the question is, will we listen this time? Or will we wait until the collapse comes too fast? Again, I touched the cold granite, feeling the weight of those names, those lives, those warnings that came too late only because people refused to hear them in time. And I made a promise. To them, to myself, to everyone who would read this memorial. Next time, we will listen. Next time, the warning will be enough. Next time, the collapse will be prevented instead of mourned. Because that's the only way their deaths will mean anything. The only way my warning, my failure to make them listen, will transform into something that saves lives instead of counting the dead. The sun set behind the memorial, casting long shadows across the names. And somewhere in the city, another engineer was probably seeing another crack, running another calculation, preparing another warning. I just hoped, prayed, that this time, someone would listen before it was too late.